The late autumn afternoon descended upon Anderson Hall like a pale yellow veil, draping every corner of the walls, every wooden door that had faded with age. Tiny dust particles floated in the beam of light streaming through the time-stained glass windows, shimmering briefly before dissipating into the stillness. The creaking sound of floorboards echoed from somewhere like a whisper from the past that only those who had been here for years could hear. Above, amidst the intricate web of scaffolding, Ethan Walker bent over 1 foot, hooked on a horizontal bar, both hands gripping the worn-out screwdriver. He turned the stubborn screw slowly and steadily, the way someone who has faced fire and smoke knows haste only invites risk. 40 feet below the stage, bathed in the glow of polished wood, lay still like a great beast sleeping through the winter. The velvet-covered seats were arranged neatly quiet, as if waiting for the first note of music to sound. Behind the stage curtain fluttered gently in the breeze, slipping through a crack in the door, revealing the shadowy space of the backstage. Ethan lowered his head, his gaze landing on the brass plaque attached to the old stage light he was dismantling. The engraved words read, "Whitmore Lighting Co. Starlight Model 2006. The letters had faded, but were still sharp enough to stir curiosity. Starlight. The name sounded both proud and melancholic, like a star forgotten in the darkness of its own existence. Dad Lily's voice rang out from below the stage, soft but firm. He paused, tilting his head to look down. The little girl was standing right next to the wings, her brown hair hurriedly braided, wearing a blue hoodie zipped all the way up to her neck, despite the warm air from the stage lights. She was clutching her sketchbook so tightly, her fingers were turning white. "You shouldn't be in here," Ethan said, the corner of his mouth curving into a tired but warm smile. "You shouldn't be up there at this hour either," Lily replied, tilting her face up, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous yet concerned gleam. He chuckled softly, the sound echoing in the steel frame like an acknowledgement. "You hit the nail on the head." "What's that light for?" she asked, pointing to the large metal object covered in a thick layer of dust like ash. "This is the starlight. It's designed to cast a single beam of light on the performer. When it's on, no one looks anywhere else." He lightly touched the lamp's casing, as if introducing an old friend. "Does it remember who turned it on last?" Her unexpected question made him pause. Ethan was silent for a few seconds before answering with a vague smile. But in his mind, he briefly recalled the blurry image of the times he stood in smoke holding a flashlight to lead his team, moments when light was the boundary between life and death. The wooden door creaked open, echoing in the empty space. The sound of high heels clicking on the wooden floor, steady and decisive. A figure appeared in the middle of the stage, Victoria Hale. Her navy suit hugged her tall frame. Her black hair was neatly tied up, not a strand out of place. Under the rehearsal lights, her face was like a cold mirror reflecting everything around her, yet rarely revealing what lay beneath. "Who's up there?" Her voice rang out, not loud, but enough to echo to the scaffolding. "Maintenance," Ethan replied, still gripping the steel frame. "Maintenance at 7:30 in the evening." "The light doesn't care what time it is, ma'am," he answered calmly. Her lips twitched slightly as if she had almost smiled, but quickly restrained herself. "Finish up and get down. There's a VIP rehearsal tomorrow morning." "Understood." She turned and walked away, the sound of her shoes echoing steadily. But just before disappearing into the wings, her eyes glanced up briefly, pausing at the old light beside him, just for a moment. But Ethan caught a glimpse of something in her gaze, like someone remembering an old room they had once left behind, both unfamiliar and haunting. As the door closed, Anderson Hall sank back into its thick silence. The only sound the faint ringing of metal as Ethan turned the screw. He looked down at Lily. The little girl had sat down in the aisle between the 2 rows of seats, opening her sketchbook and starting to sketch lines. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "Dad, me." "You look like you're fixing a lighthouse," she said, adding a patch of yellow to the sketch. Ethan shook his head and smiled. But deep inside her, words lingered. Lighthouses are meant to guide the lost home. And maybe, just maybe, Starlight was the same. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Ethan wondered how long had it been since this light was last turned on. And if one day it lit up again, who would be standing in its beam? Victoria Hale rarely allowed herself to drift into the past. She knew how to lock the doors of history tight and keep them hidden in the darkness. But sometimes a single name or a fleeting ray of light was enough to make the old hinges creak and memories would spill out like smoke. Tonight, the name Starlight had done just that. She sat alone in a makeshift office at Anderson Hall, the desk lamp casting light over piles of program papers and rehearsal schedules. But her eyes weren't reading. They were staring through the pages back to a time 17 years ago. Victoria back then was only 17 years old, wearing the light blue dress of the lead role in The Winter's Song. That night was her biggest debut. The theater packed the air thick with anticipation, as fragile as hanging mist. Above, right in the center of the ceiling, the Starlight light hung in its position, its round lens like the eye of a god about to cast its gaze upon her. Under that light, all the surrounding noise seemed to fade away. Only the heartbeat, the breath, and the lines she had rehearsed 100 times remained. Aaron Lewis, the head of the lighting crew and also her closest friend in the troupe, was the one who had climbed the catwalk to adjust each angle. "Don't let him see you're shaking, Vic," he called down from above, his voice echoing. "Just make him believe you were born to stand in this beam of light." She smiled at him, a smile full of gratitude. Aaron was the type of person who never stood center stage, but made the light perfect for others. He had a laugh that cracked like wood striking together and warm, kind brown eyes. Then came that fateful night. A year after that debut, Anderson Hall caught fire. She was backstage rehearsing for a play. The fire alarm blared initially, just a part of the show. But the smell of burning wires quickly awakened survival instincts. The fire spread from the prop room, along with thick black smoke. Aaron was the first to climb up the catwalk to assess the situation. "Get outside first," he yelled down when he saw her and several other actors trying to pull down the curtains. "I'll cut the power," Victoria wanted to argue, but the smoke was choking her, her lungs constricting. In the final moments before she was pulled out, she saw Aaron's figure still high above his hands, gripping the Starlight controller, trying to shut off the system to prevent sparks from flying. He never made it out of there. After the fire, part of the roof collapsed, taking with it some of her best memories. Anderson Hall was closed for months for repairs. When it reopened, Victoria never returned to the stage as an actress. She refused every role, every light, choosing to stand on the other side, managing planning signing papers. She told everyone that she had grown, that it was time to create the light for others. But deep inside, she knew it was just an escape. An escape from seeing herself under the starlight and remembering that it once enveloped both her and Aaron. Now, in this quiet room, the memory resurfaced vividly. Victoria raised her hand and touched the delicate silver necklace around her neck with a tiny theater mask pendant. The back was engraved with 2 letters, A.L., Aaron Lewis. The engraving had worn down, but the scratches around it were still as sharp as the day they were made. Her hand clenched, and his voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let him see you're shaking, Vic. Let the light do the rest." A soft knock at the door brought her back to the present. It was Jenna, the event manager. "Here's the schedule for tomorrow's gala, Ms." Jenna said, placing the folder on the desk. "Thank you," Victoria replied, her voice still calm as usual. When the door closed, she sighed. In front of her, the list of sponsors' VIP guests stood out with Richard Cole's name, highlighted the one who always reminded her about professionalism, about safety procedures, about not letting emotions interfere with the performance. She understood that. She had lived by that principle for 17 years. But tonight, when she looked up at the old starlight light on the ceiling for the first time, she wondered, had she held on to that principle for too long? She rose from her chair and walked into the hallway. The yellow light bathed the old theater posters, the actors' faces looking at her through the glass, as if asking, "When will you return?" At the end of the hall, she stopped, looking up through the large window to the stage. Above in the scaffolding was Ethan Walker's silhouette bent over the starlight light. The light from his safety lamp illuminated his face, highlighting the concentration and patience of someone used to working in an environment where mistakes are not allowed. In that moment, Victoria realized she was holding her breath. Not because she feared he would fall, but because the faint light flickering from the old lamp. A light she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. She turned and hurried back to her office. But her heart hadn't quite caught up to its normal rhythm. The afternoon before the gala, Anderson Hall was bustling like a beehive disturbed. Groups of technicians rushed across the stage, carrying cables, toolboxes, and aluminum ladders set up side by side. The sounds of drills, hammers, and voices calling out mixed together into a vibrant yet tense symphony. Ethan Walker stood by the wings, coiling a long electrical cord, his eyes fixed on the array of lights hanging high above. With years of experience in the fire department, he was used to observing the space, detecting risks before they turned into disasters. And right now, something about the lights in Anderson Hall unsettled him. At that moment, a dry pop sounded from above. The entire auditorium paused for a beat, then the yellow beams from the main lights flickered rapidly, like a heart in arrhythmia. Some bulbs went completely out, leaving dark patches on the stage. "Damn it, the center's lost power," a technician shouted from the control panel. The sound of flip-flops echoed as the assistant ran off to find the person in charge. Ethan set the coil down and walked closer. "What's happening?" "The wash center blew." The technician replied, panic in his voice. "If we don't reconnect it, tonight's rehearsal is over." "What's your plan?" "We'll reroute through the backup circuit, get power from the Outer Banks," the technician said quickly, his hand already reaching for the switch. Ethan immediately shook his head. "If you do that, you'll lose the entire power for the Starlight rig. The whole system was piggybacked from the last upgrade. You'll turn off more than you turn on. You're not in the lighting crew." Another person interrupted, their voice irritated. "We know what we're doing. Trust me, I've crawled through live wires before. If you want to save this rehearsal, you need to fix it from the junction box at the center fly, not switch the power." The air grew heavy for a few seconds. The sound of decisive footsteps echoed from behind. Victoria Hale appeared holding a tablet, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. "What's going on, blown circuit?" "We're switching to the backup," the technician reported. "No." Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "If you do that, you'll lose more than you gain. The only way is to go to the junction box, up high." 40 feet, no safety line, one person protested. "We'll need to rent a lift. The lift will take at least 30 minutes to arrive and set up." "By then, you'll already have the audience waiting," Ethan replied. Victoria looked directly at him. "Can you do it?" "In 10 minutes, Ethan said without hesitation. 15 if the circuit is burned through." She paused for a few seconds, her gaze weighing the risks and rewards. In her mind, the image of Aaron briefly flashed along with his voice. "Sometimes you have to let someone else climb in your place." "All right," she nodded. "You've got 10 minutes. Ethan didn't say anything further. He quickly walked behind the stage, climbing up the metal ladder attached to the wall. The rungs vibrated lightly under his feet, the tremors traveling up his calves and into his palms. The air up high was warmer, the smell of metal and hot dust hitting his nose. Reaching the junction box, he opened the lid, the flashlight beam revealing a section of wire burned black, the plastic casing deformed. "It's too old," he muttered, pulling out a utility knife to cut away the damaged part. Every move was slow and precise, as if repairing a vital artery. Below, Victoria's voice rang out, "How much longer?" 4 minutes, he called back, his hands securing the connector while holding the wires steady. He twisted the lock, the circuit closed. A deep thump echoed, then the entire washlight array flickered to life. Golden light spilling onto the stage, like water overflowing a dam. A cheer rang out from the tech crew. Ethan packed up his tools and climbed down. His hands were slightly coated in soot, the acrid smell still lingering in his nose, but his heartbeat was steady, quiet satisfaction. When his feet hit the floor, Victoria stood waiting. "You've saved this rehearsal," she said, her voice calm, though her eyes softened a bit. "Now get off the stage." Ethan nodded. He didn't argue, just glanced briefly at the starlight lights still off, then walked into the wings. In his mind, a thought took root, Kuhn. That star will shine again. The stage had fallen silent again after the tense rehearsal. The technicians scattered toward the exits, their voices and laughter gradually blending into the vast emptiness of Anderson Hall. Only Ethan's footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, as if intentional. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. In moments like this, when the lights dimmed, when the warmth of the auditorium still lingered, but the noise had faded away, he could feel a different kind of breath of the place, slow, deep, and profound. High above, the old starlight sat motionless in its cradle, dark, as though it had been asleep for years. He looked up, the faint light from a few maintenance lamps, casting a dull gray halo onto the dusty glass. Ethan pulled a large folding ladder from the prop room, the old wheels squeaking. He pushed it to the center of the stage, placing it right under the starlight. With every step he took up the ladder, the metallic sound echoed through the empty auditorium like the ticking of a countdown clock. When he reached the lamp, he slipped his sleeve over his hand and wiped away the thick layer of dust. A patch of copper appeared, and beneath the tarnish he saw the second engraved plaque, smaller, hidden behind the metal ridge, "Victoria Hale." Dedicated to A.L. Gone too soon. He paused. The letters were sharp and sad, like a thin cut. A.L. He didn't need anyone to tell him who that was. Someone important enough to have their name etched on the heart of this light. Ethan unscrewed the back panel. Inside was a thick, solid, and neatly arranged network of copper wiring, the kind of craftsmanship he no longer saw in modern products. The circuit still had a path, but the power switch had been sealed with red tape marked with the words, "Do not use." Most people would stop here. Rules are rules. But Ethan knew that some rules were made not because of danger, but because of fear. And he wouldn't let that fear control him. From below, Lily's voice called out, "What are you doing, Dad?" He looked down and saw his daughter sitting on the floor, her sketchbook open. In the drawing, a beam of bright yellow light stretched from the ceiling straight down onto the stage, surrounding a figure. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "Starlight," she answered simply. "But it's not on. Not yet." Lily said, her eyes never leaving the page, as if it was a given. Her words, soft as a breath, touched a chord deep inside him. He remembered the times he'd gone on fire rescues, when the smoke was thick, when everything else was just darkness, and the sound of a beating heart, people clinging to the smallest light to find their way. Starlight could do that not just for a performance, but for those who had forgotten their dreams. He closed the lamp's panel and climbed down the ladder, looking at her drawing. "What's the yellow supposed to be?" "It's the thing that makes people feel warm and not scared." Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. I think you just gave me a mission." That night he went to the maintenance room, searching through the old file cabinet. In the bottom drawer, he pulled out a yellowed tube and carefully unrolled it. The original electrical diagram of Anderson Hall sprawled out on the table, the circuit lines drawn by hand, the pencil strokes faint. Under the Starlight circuit section was a handwritten note, installed by request of V. Hale. Dedicated to A.L. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Now he was sure to bring this light back to life. He wasn't just repairing a device. He was restoring a piece of someone's memory. He carefully rolled the blueprint back up and set it aside. Outside, the night wind swept through the empty street, the sound of dry leaves rustling like the gentle stir of stage curtains. In his mind, the image of Starlight blazing to life appeared vividly, a golden circle warm centered on the stage. And within that beam of light, anyone daring enough to step into it could be seen. Before turning off the maintenance room lights, Ethan whispered to himself, "Not long now. I will let it live again." The gala night at Anderson Hall was the event the whole city had been anticipating for months. From the entrance, warm golden light spilled over the red carpet, reflecting off the glass doors, making the building seem to radiate warmth in the chill of early winter. The crowd dressed in formal attire slowly made their way inside, their laughter and conversation blending with the sound of crystal glasses clinking together, a steady rhythm like a carefully orchestrated soundtrack. Ethan stood partially hidden behind the curtain wings, his maintenance uniform allowing him to blend into the shadows with the rest of the backstage crew. On his shoulder, his familiar tool bag hung, but tonight he carried something else, the old Starlight controller, thoroughly cleaned and checked. The circuits were steady, the backup power ready. Just one action, and the dormant star would awaken. Outside, the soft sounds of string instruments filled the air, signaling that the program was about to begin. Victoria Hale appeared backstage, standing tall, her shoulders slightly tense. She wore a dark blue form-fitting dress, the soft fabric exuding power, and the light catching her eyes, making them shimmer like a deep lake. Ethan noticed her hands slightly tightening around the speech cards. A small gesture, but he recognized it instantly. This woman had once stood under the lights, and she knew the feeling of a heart beating faster than usual before stepping out in front of hundreds of eyes. The MC's voice rang out. "Please give a round of applause for the CEO of the Anderson Fund, Miss Victoria Hale." The stage curtains parted. Victoria stepped onto the stage, her steps measured, maintaining perfect balance on her high heels. The golden wash light spread evenly over her, but Ethan knew that light. It wasn't Starlight. She began her speech with a practiced tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we are not just celebrating the revival of an architectural landmark." Her voice was steady, polished, but Ethan, standing on the sidelines, felt that it was missing a true heartbeat. His hand brushed over the Starlight controller. A small click sounded in the darkness. High above in the ceiling, the Starlight flickered to life. The warm, focused golden light poured down onto Victoria, enveloping her completely. The light was so sharp that every detail from the outline of her dress to the glint on her earrings became perfectly clear. But strangely, under that light, she no longer resembled a CEO at a podium. She looked like an actress who had waited years to return to her rightful place. Victoria paused for a moment, her eyes widening. The auditorium fell silent, every gaze fixed on her. She took a deep breath and lowered her speech cards. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, softer, more genuine, as if she were speaking directly to each person in the room. "Tonight," she said slowly, "we are not just celebrating bricks and wood lights and curtains. We are celebrating the power of light, something that can find you, even when you've stopped searching for it." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. In the middle row, Richard Cole, the largest sponsor, frowned slightly, but no one took their eyes off the stage. "I stood here many years ago," Victoria continued, "when Starlight shone down. I believed I belonged to it. Then one day, I stepped out of that circle of light. I thought I'd never return. But it turns out, the hardest thing wasn't finding the light, but letting it touch me again. A heavy silence settled over the room. Ethan stood in the shadows, his hands still resting on the switch, his eyes fixed on the golden beam of light. He saw Victoria's shoulders relax, as if an invisible burden had lifted off her. When she concluded with, "And tonight, that light is not just mine, it's ours." The applause erupted. Many people stood, shoes tapping lightly on the floor, and whistles rang out from the balcony. Ethan turned off the starlight, leaving the regular wash light to shine. He stepped back, blending into the crew, preparing for the next act. For him, that moment was enough. No one needed to know who had flicked the switch, as long as the one who needed it had received it. When the program took a break, Victoria left the stage and quickly walked into the wings. She stopped in front of Ethan. Without a word, she looked at him for a few seconds. That gaze conveyed both a silent thank you and an unspoken question. Then she gave a slight nod and turned to leave. In the audience, Lily sat among the elegantly dressed adults, her eyes sparkling. She smiled as if she knew exactly who had brought the light back. And somewhere high above, in the shadows of the scaffolding, the starlight lay still. But its lens remained warm, as if recalling why it had been placed there in the first place. The morning after the gala night, Anderson Hall still seemed to carry a faint echo of applause and lively music. But for Ethan, that atmosphere quickly faded when he received an urgent message from the management office. "Report to the CEO's office immediately." He walked down the third-floor corridor where photographs commemorating the major events of the theater lined the walls. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, each step feeling heavier. At the end of the hall, the door to Victoria's office was ajar, but the voices inside were enough for him to recognize Richard Cole's voice, deep, cold, and authoritative. "We cannot let staff interfere with the lighting system, especially in a national event," Richard said, each word clear. "Who allowed him to turn on that starlight?" Victoria's voice responded, controlled. "No one gave permission, but he saved the moment last night." The audience was moved, the sponsors were satisfied. "Can you deny that emotions are great?" Richard snapped, "But emotions don't pay the bills." That light was removed from the plan for safety reasons. If it malfunctions and falls during the gala, who will be responsible, you or him? Ethan stood silently outside his hand, subconsciously tightening around his tool bag. He knew he had taken a risk, but at the time, he believed everything he did had been calculated carefully. More importantly, he believed Victoria needed that light to rediscover herself. The sound of papers rustling. Then Richard continued, "I demand he be fired. Today." Before Victoria could respond, Ethan pushed the door open and stepped in. "If anyone should take the responsibility, it's me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Both turned to look at him. Richard crossed his arms, his gaze sharp as a blade. "You know, you violated safety regulations, disrupted the technical plan, and put the entire event at risk, don't you?" Ethan nodded. "I know. But I also know that starlight was thoroughly checked, the mounting frame reinforced, and the wires replaced. The risk was nearly zero. And I also know there are moments, if missed, that will never come again." Richard chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you're a hero? This isn't a movie." Ethan looked straight into his eyes. "No, I just think sometimes doing the right thing isn't in the manual." The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Victoria stood up, walking around to the front of her desk. "Richard, I won't fire him. If needed, I'll sign anything to take the responsibility." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You're letting emotions control you. A CEO can't run a company on impulse light switches." Maybe, Victoria replied, her eyes still fixed on Ethan, but a human being can. And sometimes that's what makes us different from cold reports. Richard was silent for a few seconds before saying, "Fine. But from now on, I'll personally oversee all technical operations. And you." He turned to Ethan. "One more time, and you'll be out." Ethan nodded without arguing. He knew this was the only compromise to keep his job and to keep Starlight from being dismantled again. When Richard left the room and the door shut, Victoria sighed. "You didn't have to take all the blame," she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. "If I didn't, I'd miss the chance to keep that light alive for both the theater and for you." Their eyes met in a quiet moment. No words of thanks, but both understood. When Ethan left the office, Lily was waiting in the lobby, her backpack slightly larger than she was. "Dad, yesterday I saw Mom. Well, I saw her under that light like a queen. You did the right thing." Ethan bent down and ruffled his daughter's brown hair. "Sometimes you just need to believe in what you're doing, even if others don't understand right away." Outside, the sky was still thick with fog. But in Ethan's eyes, the golden glow of starlight remained intact, waiting for the day to shine again. This time, not to save a performance, but to ignite a new story, one that no one had written yet. The basement of Anderson Hall was a place few ever visited. It was filled with old wooden shelves, dusty prop boxes, and the steady hum of the underground generator. Ethan often came down here when he needed a rare spare part, or simply wanted to escape the noise of the stage. But today, he never expected to find Victoria here standing in the narrow strip of light, coming through the ventilation shaft, flipping through a yellowed file. She startled when she heard his footsteps, then smiled faintly. "You're making me remember my days as an intern. I used to spend hours down here just trying to find the right size screw for a stage light." Ethan set his toolbox down and leaned against the wooden shelf. "I thought you didn't like the smell of mold down here." "I don't," she admitted, "but sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in places no one expects. Like starlight." She hesitated, her eyes distant for a moment. "You know, when that light came on during the gala, I didn't just see the stage. I saw myself at 18, standing backstage, hands shaking, but eyes shining because I truly believed I belonged here." Ethan stayed silent, letting her continue. He could feel the heartbeat in her voice, real emotion, not the words of a cold CEO. Victoria sat down on an old wooden chair. "I had forgotten that feeling for so long. I forgot because I had to become the manager instead of living in the moment. Richard wasn't wrong when he said I had to keep this theater alive with numbers. But that night, you made me realize that if we live by the numbers alone, this theater will die quietly." Ethan pulled another chair closer. "You've paid the price. Last night, Richard nearly fired me and pressured you. But you still chose to protect that light." Victoria smiled faintly, though the weariness was clear. "Because I knew that once it's gone, no one will dare to dream again. I was once like that, and I don't want that to happen to anyone, not even to myself." He looked around the basement. Old light boxes, cables twisted with cloth tape torn panels. "Maybe it's time to bring back the forgotten things down here. Not just a light, but a corner of Anderson Hall." Victoria followed his gaze. "What are you thinking?" "There's enough material here to build a small stage," Ethan said, tapping gently on a wooden crate. "We could turn this basement into an experimental performance space, where young artists are allowed to fail, allowed to dream before stepping onto the main stage." The idea made Victoria's eyes light up, but quickly a hint of doubt crept in. "Richard won't approve. You know that. Then don't call it an art project. Call it a technical training workshop for stage crew." We test lights, sound, and set designs here, but really, it's about creating a second stage." She chuckled softly. "You really know how to bend the rules." "Not bend," Ethan replied, "but find another way to do what's right." They sat there for a long while, discussing every detail from the electrical system, upgrades, to how to arrange the wooden chairs in rows. Their voices blended with the hum of the generator, creating a strange, secretive warmth, as if the basement was becoming the new heart of the theater. Before leaving, Victoria paused at the last step. "Ethan, I've never told anyone, but the last time I stood on the stage with Starlight, I promised myself that if I ever lost that feeling, I'd find a way to reignite it. You've helped me keep that promise." Ethan smiled, saying nothing. He knew that this conversation would change many things, not just for the theater, but for them as well. As the basement door closed behind him, the light from the ventilation shaft still cast a glow on the old props. It seemed as though even these inanimate objects were waiting for the day to be revived, just as Starlight had waited for 17 years. And this time, Ethan was certain that they wouldn't let anyone turn it off again. That morning, the sky over New York was veiled in a thin mist, the sunlight filtering through the streets in soft golden beam, a touch cool in the air. Ethan was crouched adjusting a few stage lights when a rhythmic knock echoed from the wings. He looked up to find Victoria standing there, holding a thick file, her expression a mix of seriousness and a hidden excitement. "Ethan," she called out, "are you free for lunch?" He wiped his hands on a cloth and nodded. "What's going on? You look like you've just found treasure." Victoria didn't respond immediately. She simply motioned for him to follow, walking through the long, quiet corridor of Anderson Hall. They stopped in front of a small meeting room at the end of the hall, where light streamed through the window onto the long wooden table. On the table alongside the file she brought was an ivory-colored envelope slightly worn with the words "Riverside Theater Restoration Committee" printed in the corner. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Riverside Theater? The abandoned theater on the west side?" "Yes," Victoria replied, pulling up a chair and opening the file. "It used to be the jewel of the city, but it's been closed for over 20 years. The foundation is still intact, and the steel frame of the stage is still standing. But everything else is rotting." Ethan flipped through a few old photographs, dusty red seats, a cracked stage, tattered velvet curtains. Yet in one corner of the photo, he spotted the old lighting system, those rare friends that had survived, and among them, one light that looked eerily similar to Starlight. "The Restoration Committee has invited me to join as an artistic advisor." Victoria continued, her gaze fixed on him. "But I don't want to just be a paper advisor. I want Riverside to truly come back to life. And to do that, I need you." Ethan hesitated. "Me, Victoria, I'm just a lighting technician and janitor, not an architect or an investor." "You're the one who brought the light back to Anderson Hall," she responded immediately, her voice firm. "You have the eye of an artist, the hands of a skilled craftsman. And more than that, you understand that light isn't just for illumination. It tells a story." Ethan was silent for a moment. The images of Riverside kept swirling in his mind. The decay, but also the lingering soul waiting to be awakened. He remembered the feeling of turning on Starlight, seeing the light sweep through the auditorium, moving the hearts of the audience. "Restoring an old theater isn't easy," he said slowly. "It'll cost a lot of money, a lot of work, and there'll definitely be resistance." Victoria smiled, a challenge and trust mixed in her expression. "I don't need a safe answer. I need to know, will you dare?" He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. In his mind, he saw Lily, his daughter, sitting in the audience, her eyes shining as she took in the stage. If Riverside came back to life, perhaps other children would find their dreams there too. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it, but with one condition." Victoria tilted her head. "What's the condition?" "We won't just restore it for beauty's sake. Riverside has to be open to everyone from famous artists to kids who've never stepped on stage. It will be a place where anyone can tell their story." She nodded immediately, as though this had been her desire all along. Deal. The rest of the afternoon was spent together, spreading out the files, blueprints, and old photographs on the table. Victoria told stories about Riverside's history, how it once hosted legendary performances, was a gathering place for both artists and dock workers, and how the sound of applause mixed with the waves of the Hudson River. Ethan analyzed the old lighting system, sketching a new lighting diagram that blended the classic with modern techniques. At times, they argued over the color of the curtains, the style of chairs, and whether to preserve the peeling walls as part of the memory. But every time their eyes met, they both smiled, knowing they were rowing in the same direction. When the clock struck 2 p.m., Victoria closed the file and handed him the official invitation envelope. "Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the committee. They need to hear our plan, and perhaps they'll need some convincing." Ethan took the envelope, feeling as if he were holding a key to open a grand door. "They'll listen. Because this isn't just about restoring a theater, it's about restoring a dream." On the way back to Anderson Hall's stage, he looked up at the strip of light coming through the tall window, thinking about Riverside, the dusty days, and the bright nights. Inside, a fire had begun to smolder, just like the time he turned on Starlight, but this time that light would shine on an entire theater sleeping by the river. On the first morning, Ethan stepped into Riverside Theater. The morning mist from the Hudson River still carried a damp chill, filling the air like the breath of a giant deep in slumber. The massive wooden door of the theater creaked with a heavy sound as he pushed it open, like the groan of a place that had been forgotten for too long. Inside, the dust was so thick that the light streaming through the cracks in the door created murky golden streaks that fell slowly to the ground. The velvet-covered seats had lost their color, many of them leaning to one side, as though bowing in regret. The ceiling had peeled away, revealing rotting wood and cobwebs as dense as the abandoned stage curtains. Ethan took slow steps, each footfall echoing with the remnants of thousands of clapping hands long gone. He touched the railing of the staircase, the roughness reminding him of his days in Anderson Hall. But this time the challenge was greater, more brutal. The sound of a metal door creaking behind him made him turn. Victoria appeared dressed in jeans and a checkered shirt, a stark contrast to her usual cold CEO demeanor. She carried a large coffee thermos, with 2 strong men pushing a cart of equipment behind her. "Welcome to the construction site." She smiled, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "From today, Riverside is our home." They began by inspecting the electrical system. Ethan climbed the tiered seating, carefully tracing each old wire, catching a faint smell of burnt plastic. "Everything needs replacing," he said, his voice firm. "If not just one spark, and this place will turn to ash." The days that followed felt like an excavation. Victoria and the volunteer team ripped down the decayed curtains, pried up each floorboard to check its integrity. One afternoon, they discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath the stage floor. Inside were tickets to Riverside's last performance in 2002, along with a faded photograph of the cast. Victoria held the photo for a long time, her eyes deep in thought. These faces, they deserved to see the light again. The work was tough but full of surprising moments. One afternoon, as Ethan was cutting away the singed wires from the light rig, a small spark flew out and landed on the dusty wood at his feet. For a moment, he thought he had just burned Riverside's past. But he quickly extinguished it with his gloved hand, exhaling in relief. Victoria, standing below, looked up with a half-joking, half-worried smile. "That spark. I hope it's only here to ignite, not burn away our dreams." There were afternoons when they sat on the theater's front steps, eating sandwiches and sipping coffee, while the sound of train whistles echoed from the docks. Victoria shared with Ethan the memory of her first visit to Riverside at the age of 9, wearing a yellow dress her mother had sewn, sitting in the third row, enchanted by the dazzling light on the stage. That day, I thought if I could live under that light forever, I wouldn't need anything else. Ethan listened quietly, but in his heart he felt an invisible bond between them. They both carried a memory of light, something that could not be measured in money. The cleanup gradually shifted to the installation of new systems. Modern light rigs were brought in, but Ethan was determined to keep some of the old lights, carefully repairing them so they could still work. He said, "They are witnesses' memories. We can't throw them away." Victoria agreed, even suggesting a small display area in the lobby to tell the history of Riverside's lighting. On the 14th day, the team decided to try turning on the new electrical system for the first time. Everyone held their breath as Ethan flipped the switch. A sharp click sounded, and then light flooded the auditorium, chasing away the dark dust. Victoria stood in the middle of the stage, spinning around like a child, her eyes sparkling. "Ethan, this is just the beginning, but I already see Riverside coming back to life." He looked down at his calloused hands and smiled faintly. "We still have much to do. But if each light is a promise, then today Riverside just received hundreds of promises." Outside, the Hudson River glittered in the afternoon light, reflecting the new rays that had just flared up inside the old theater. The dust remained, the work was still unfinished, but among it all, the spark of hope would truly take a root. That evening, Riverside Theater stood still, as if holding its breath. Outside, the New York autumn night sky was filled with thin, scattered clouds, and the moon peered through, only to hide again in the darkness. Inside the theater, the atmosphere was as tense as a taut string. All the cleaning and repairs over the past weeks had led up to this moment, the first test of the new Starlight system, the heart of the stage. Ethan stood on the stage floor, holding the main controller, sweat soaking into his leather gloves despite the cool air. He had unscrewed every bolt, cleaned every reflector, and installed each new LED bulb, blending them with the restored old lights. The rig now was not just a lighting system. It was a fusion of the past and present, a mix of memory and renewal. Victoria walked up to him, dressed in a simple black dress, but her eyes shone brighter than any light. "Are you ready?" Her voice was soft but clear. Ethan swallowed. "Ready? Not exactly, but I think Riverside has waited long enough." Below, the volunteers, technicians, and a few community members who had signed the project petition stood in a circle, their eyes fixed on the stage. In one corner, an elderly woman with silver hair who had worked as a ticket seller at Riverside for 30 years clutched a worn ticket from 2002 in her trembling hands. Ethan took a deep breath. 3, 2, 1. He pressed the button. In an instant, the darkness seemed to tear apart. A cascade of golden light streamed down from the ceiling, weaving through every corner of the stage. The fine beams of light fell like threads, reflecting on the tiny dust particles, making them sparkle like falling stars. At the center of the stage, the new Starlight unleashed its full power. No longer the cold white light of the past, it was a warm golden glow that enveloped everything, like an embrace. The old lights, interspersed with the new, created layers of light nostalgic and dazzling at once. Victoria looked up, her eyes wide. In that light, she saw herself again, the 9-year-old girl in a yellow dress, sitting in the third row, eyes shining brightly as the stage first came to life. A powerful wave of emotion surged within her, choking her throat. "Oh my God," the elderly ticket seller whispered, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. It's come back to life." The applause started hesitantly, then grew louder, echoing for a long time. A few young people filmed the moment with their phones, but Ethan didn't look. He stood there, eyes lifted, slightly misty. Not because of sweat or dust, but because he knew that in that moment, he had returned a piece of the soul to this place. Victoria stepped forward to the center of the auditorium, her voice trembling. This is not just the light of Riverside. This is the light of every memory, of every dream that was forgotten, of the hands that have worked tirelessly to bring them back. And I promise under this starlight, no dream will ever be forgotten again. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time since the project began, he saw a new kind of belief in his own eyes. Not a belief in technique, but in people, in the fact that when a group of individuals is united by the same purpose, they can reignite an entire sky that had long been dark. The light test ended, but no one was in a rush to leave. They sat scattered around the auditorium, speaking softly as if trying to extend the moment under the warm glow. A young boy from the back row ran down to the stage, tilted his head back, and said, "I want to stand here when I grow up." Victoria bent down and gently patted his head. "And you will. Riverside will wait for you." When everyone finally left, only Ethan and Victoria remained in the theater. The starlight still poured down, gentle yet persistent. Ethan asked, I think we've just turned on more than just a lighting system." Victoria tilted her head. "What do you mean, we've just turned on Riverside's heartbeat again?" He smiled. Outside, the rain began to fall lightly, reflecting the light from the theater's windows, turning Riverside into a glowing jewel amidst the empty streets. And in their hearts, they both knew this moment would live on forever. From early morning, Riverside Theater buzzed with activity like a beehive. The early autumn sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned glass windows, casting golden dust motes that lingered in the air. The sound of hammers nailing promotional posters for the first performance mixed with the rehearsal of instruments from the orchestra inside. Ethan had been there before dawn, walking down each row of seats, checking every little detail. He bent down to smooth the red velvet covering the stage platform, adjusting the small reserved sign on the front row. Every step he took carried a sense of excitement he couldn't describe. For years he had only dreamed of seeing Riverside light up again, and now that dream was no longer just a dream. Victoria was almost constantly on her phone. She coordinated staff, answered dozens of messages from the press, and continuously signed logistical papers. But every time she passed by the auditorium, she would glance up at the starlight system, her expression softening. That light was no longer just hers, it belonged to everyone who had contributed to its revival. In the afternoon, special guests began to arrive. Some familiar faces from Riverside's past, former actors, musicians, and backstage staff. Some were frail, leaning on canes, but still they came. When they entered the auditorium, they paused for a long while, as if letting the light, the smell of old wood, and the familiar echoes reconnect with their memories. The elderly ticket seller from years ago wore a beige coat holding a small bouquet of flowers. When she saw Ethan, she grasped his hand tightly. "My dear, I never thought I would see Riverside come back to life. Thank you for keeping your promise to this city." Ethan only smiled, unable to respond, his throat tightening. At exactly 7 p.m., the seating bell rang. The rows began to fill. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, leaving only faint halos on the stage. The backstage was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the artists' hearts beating, preparing to step out. Victoria walked out onto the stage, dressed in a dark green dress, standing beneath starlight. Her voice, though low, carried across the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is not just a performance. It is a night of memory and future. Riverside has been asleep for nearly 2 decades. But thanks to the hands and hearts of many tonight, we are here under this light together." The applause started slowly, then grew into a prolonged wave. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. The orchestra began the first notes, a reworked overture from the pieces that had once echoed through this stage many years ago. The melody was both unfamiliar and familiar, as if guiding the audience through streets of memory. Each time the light changed, reflecting off the velvet backdrop, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stood backstage watching everything unfold. No one noticed his hand clenching slightly as he recalled the months filled with dust and paint smells when he and everyone had worked late into the night for this moment. Midway through the performance, an unexpected act took place. Victoria, along with some of Riverside's old artists, came forward to sing "Bring Back the Light," the song that had closed the theater's final season. The lyrics rang out, under starlight moving many to tears. Among the audience were even children who had never known what Riverside was. Yet they sat in silence, eyes wide open, as if seeing something very important. When the song ended, Victoria stood still for a moment, then said, "This light will never go out again. We will protect it together." In that moment, Ethan felt the weariness of the past months melt away. He knew that this wasn't just the success of a restoration project. This was proof that when a community believes in something, they can rekindle a dream. The performance ended with a slow curtain fall accompanied by a thunderous round of applause and cheers. Many people stayed behind to take photos, touching the rows of seats as if trying to hold on to the memory. As the auditorium gradually emptied, Ethan walked up to the stage, standing next to Victoria. They both looked up at starlight, still shining. "We did it," Ethan whispered. Victoria nodded, smiling warmly. "No, Ethan. We all did it." Outside New York continued its noisy pace. But inside Riverside, the warm golden light seemed like a promise that would be many more nights, many more stories, and many more hearts lit beneath this roof. The next evening, a light rain fell over New York, leaving shimmering streaks on the stone path in front of Riverside Theater. The city buzzed on, but inside the theater, everything had settled. The empty seats, the scent of fresh wood and red velvet still lingered along with the warmth from the opening night just a day before. Ethan sat in the middle row, where he had spent countless nights imagining this very moment. Beside him was a small flashlight, an old habit from the days of repairs that still hadn't left him. He flicked it on, casting light on the ceiling, then stopping at starlight. Its gentle golden glow responded like a quiet greeting. The door to the auditorium opened softly. Victoria walked in draped in a beige trench coat. Her hair was slightly damp from the rain, a few strands clinging to her cheek. She said nothing, just walked over and sat beside him. For a long while they both sat in silence, staring up at starlight. "You know," Victoria spoke at last, her voice low as though speaking to herself last night when the song ended. "I thought maybe this is just the beginning. Riverside won't just tell old stories, it will create new ones for those who have never entered this world." Ethan nodded softly. "This light, it's illuminated your past, and now it will guide the future for many others. But keeping it alive won't be easy." She smiled, her head tilting toward him. "Not easy, but I believe once the light has found hearts that want to keep it, it will never fade." Outside, the rain seemed to slow down. In that moment, both of them felt an invisible thread connecting the starlight above them to where they sat. It was not just a light, not just a stage. It was memory. It was promise. It was all the hands that had touched this project with belief. A few days later, Victoria held a press conference in the theater lobby. The press crowded, asking questions, flashes of cameras going off. She announced a new initiative, a free training program for young people passionate about performing arts using Riverside as an open theater school for the community. Ethan stood quietly in the back, observing. Amid the crowd, he spotted a young girl with curly hair, her bright eyes sparkling as she heard about the opportunity to learn dance on this very stage. Her gaze reminded him of the day he first stepped into Riverside, a teenager with nothing but a bag and a small dream. That evening, after everyone had left, Ethan walked onto the stage alone. He stood in the exact spot where he had seen Victoria sing on opening night, then looked up at starlight. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure whether he was thanking the light Victoria or the long, hard months that had led to this moment. From behind, footsteps echoed. It was the elderly ticket seller from the opening night. She approached slowly, handing him a small parcel. "Someone sent this to you. They said you'll know when to open it." Ethan took the package, feeling its moderate weight. When he opened it, inside was an old notebook. Its leather spine cracked lightly, filled with notes about Riverside's past performances, along with a few black and white photos. On the last page, there was a handwritten note: "Keep the light alive. When one story ends, start telling the next one." He sat down on the stage steps, rereading each page, and realized this was the diary of Riverside's first stage manager. The stories of dress rehearsals, power outages before opening night, tears and laughter, all vividly coming to life. When he closed the notebook, Ethan knew he had one more reason to stay. Not just to protect a theater, but to ensure these memories would always be shared. Outside, the rain had stopped. Water streaks on the path reflected the streetlights, resembling fallen stars on the ground. Ethan turned off all the lights in the auditorium, leaving only starlight blazing. Its glow fell on the stage, winding through the empty seats, slipping through the slightly open door that led to the night streets. Somewhere out there, someone would see it curious enough to step inside and find a part of themselves under this roof. And Riverside Theater, with its heart of light, would never forget anyone who had ever stepped through its doors.